what it, just one second, we're trying to, yes, here we go. I'm not quite sure what that group was, though it was always enjoyable. Um, Yeah, what I'm trying to do today is really give a brief background to my father as a rebel in Ireland, but focus on the Southwest experience, which would be in California, New Mexico, Old Mexico, and then go on to follow him in Ireland. My father, born in 1897, was one of the many young rebels who fought in 1916 through 1924. Um, and they all were young. I mean, it's surprisingly when you look back on what the age these people were. My father, like many, came from a relatively well. There were several different streams people of going into Irish nationalism. In many parts of Ireland, they came from a Fenian background, where there had been unrest for years, and that was in part of the family spirit that got the young men going. In my father's case, there was no Fenian background at all. And my mother, my grandmother, lived in very comfortably. How do you push this forward? Okay, good. Sorry, we're just, yeah. My grandparents lived very comfortably in County Mayo and in Dublin. They were quite strong characters, and they had no national spirit at all. They were quite happy with Ireland as it was. I doubt if they even were supported home rule. And when it came to national causes, they were very proud of my father's two brothers joining the British Army and Dublin Fusiliers in 1914. Father didn't have to make that decision. He went off, he got a scholarship to University College Dublin to study medicine in 1915. And there he was in 1916 when the rebellion broke out. He had not been a member of any of the groups of the nationalism. He didn't have any particular sway in that moment. But as he walked down on that Easter Monday, he became convinced he was on Sackville Street, which is now called O'Connell Street, and he saw what had happened. And he read the proclamation of independence. And he sort of said, I think he was quite struck by the words, that Ireland should be for the Irish. Anyway, he joined up right away, and he later explained that his attitude toward the fight was that of a sheltered individual drawn from the secure seclusion of Irish life to the responsibility of action. And, I think those are words which many of us feel that we are all in different points of view and different attitudes, and we all in our own time, I think, are called to take responsibility of action for whatever it is that we should do in our time. So let me just review from the 16 to 20. He joined up on that night of Easter Monday. He found a gun. He went out and with a friend. He started taking pot shots at the British Army. He later joined the Irish Volunteers. He was at university, as I mentioned, and he remained in the university, but they did good things like learning Irish, participating and selling books on Sundays to support the families who had lost members of in 1916, and also many of those fellows had been captured and sent off to jail, and the families had no source of income. So again, the Irish Volunteers helped secure funding for the families. Eventually, by 1918, Father decided that enough was enough, and he went on the run. He reported to Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy. And for the next 3 years, he was sent around Ireland, actually. And on the map here, you'll see the areas in red where he sort of fought or led activities. from 1918 when he was sent up to Tyrone, later down to Offaly, Westmeath, Longford, Roscommon, Galway, and Dublin. So you can see he had a broad spectrum of activity. What was an organizer doing? An organizer had to go into a brigade where he knew nobody. He might have gotten a name of somebody from Michael Collins. And as a young man, I mean, in 1918, he would have been 23, and he would have been going in to command country folk about military tactics. Now, those concepts are quite inconsistent. Country folks are not very good at taking orders. They're used to being their own boss, particularly if they have lived on farms. And they certainly don't want someone from even the capital of their own county, not to mention a general headquarters of the IRA, coming down to give them orders. And particularly when those orders would mean like learning how to march, which they would have thought pretty stupid, learning what the tactics are when they didn't think they actually were going to fight. And anyone who's been through the military experience will appreciate that, there's a certain amount of humdrum that you need to go through in order to get the discipline of being prepared to fight. And that's what Father's difficult task was in 1918, again in 1919. He covered Donegal, Clare, went out to the Aran Islands to try to organize a company of people, came down to Tipperary. In Tipperary, he found men who understood what he wanted to do. And I think that was his favorite county because people were willing to do what he asked them to do. Again, he went back to Donegal and Dublin. And there was an interesting tactical decision in 1920 to get on with the war against the British. And the war, remember, in 1918, there had been an election, a Sinn Féin election, where 85% of the people voted for Sinn Féin. And the word Sinn Féin meant ourselves alone and having a parliament in Ireland, not the home rule that the British had offered in 1914 and that the Irish leaders had accepted. That what 1916 has put a spanner in those works, and they wanted a complete separation with the British Empire. And so Sinn Féin had their own election. Sorry, had a regular election, but they took their seat of Parliament in Dublin. They did not want to go to London, and they started running their own government from Dublin. And Father was part of that on the military side. What was known as the Irish Volunteers was then sort of changed into the Irish Republican Army. And under the guise of the Republican Army, what they started to do was they came up with a new policy, which was to raid the RIC, Royal Irish Constabulary Barracks. And one of the first raids like that was Father in February in Monaghan in 1920. And then he came down to Tipperary, and there were 3 RIC barracks of distinction down there that they were able to capture: Tipperary, Rarecross, and Drangan. And you can see, the breadth of that map is fairly extensive in terms of what he did. So at the end of 1920, Richard Mulcahy and Michael Collins called him to Dublin and told him that he was going to be given a major command in the south of Ireland, but he first of all had to go to Kilkenny and capture something. That failed. He was captured, tortured, brought to Dublin Castle, tortured by Captain Hardy and Major King. Anyway, he was one of the few people ever in the 300 years experience of Kilmainham to escape from Kilmainham. Here's the jail wall of Kilmainham, which is fairly massive, as you can see. And that little gate there is now known as the O'Malley Gate. Father was able to get a lock to unlock the lock and cut the bar that kept the lock in place. And with 3 colleagues, he managed to escape. So I'll be going back to Ireland February 14 next year for the 102nd anniversary of his quite miraculous escape. Now, the British didn't know who he was at the time, and you can see on the right-hand side of your screen the two images that they took of Father. He was known as Ernest Stewart, and they didn't recognize who he was until June 1921, which is just before the truce. So when he got out of jail, he was given responsibility of three counties: Limerick, Tipperary, Kilkenny. There was 5 brigades and perhaps 4 to 5,000 people under his command. Led up to just before the truce. And Father was very surprised by what happened at the truce. He wasn't told from Dublin. And I think part of the antipathy by many strong-minded Republicans to the treaty go back to how the truce was created in the first place. And, for these fighters suddenly to be told to lay down arms without any explanation, and that there were going to be discussions with the British, there was no context in which that element became credible. So when the treaty came along in December 1921, that was the treaty between England, well, basically the Irish government and the English government at the time. It was called the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And that was decided on, signed on December, the morning of December 7th, 1922. 21. Father was immediately against the treaty. The treaty represented, a 26 county Ireland rather than a 32 county, an oath of allegiance to a foreign king, which is what they had been fighting against, a loss of the Irish ports, which they couldn't have participate in, that there was going to be a colonial governor in charge of Ireland, that they would have, that they were in fact a colony like Australia and Canada. And they also, their legal system was dependent upon the English because they had a privy council. So for all of these factors, and I'm sure being the 100th anniversary of the treaty that you've heard about, more lengthy explanations on that, but those are the basic Republican tenets as to why they would not support the treaty. And difficult as it was to fight against their own comrades, they felt so strongly about those points that they were willing to go to war. Of course, the war occurred, and it starts off with the forecourts in June 1922, in effect. There were many things which happened, and both parties were trying to avoid a dramatic split. But the sentiment within the Irish Republican Army was split. I don't know what extent it was precisely, but it could well have been that at least 50% of them supported the establishment of the Free State. And many people in Ireland, including as reflected in the cabinet decision, in the Doyle decision, and eventually in the electorate position of June 1922, they sort of said enough is enough, and they were willing to accept the concept as expressed by Michael Collins, that this is the first step to final independence, and we might as well take it lest we be beaten later. And they had been threatened at the discussions in London about being threatened by the immediate and terrible war by the British. Anyway, there are arguments, both sides of that you've heard before. But in terms of Ernie O'Malley, he had absolutely no doubt. He was promoted in the spring of that year to be the director of organizations in Dublin. He went on to take command of the forecourts, and the forecourts was attacked by the Free State. And that really starts the Civil War. That ends in a shamble, and in fact, bit by bit, the Republicans retreat throughout 22 and 23, and in effect, they are required to go into a guerrilla campaign, which is how they had started against the British, but that finally collapses. Now, in terms of father, he is given a very senior command, the acting chief of staff, assistant chief of staff to Liam Lynch. But he's captured in November 1922, severely wounded. One of the reasons, I mean, it always raises the hair on my head, because when you see all of the great Irish names, Republican names, who were shot during this period, I realized the only reason that I'm alive is that my father was not shot, because he had been wounded. And in terms of Sean Connolly, who had been shot in a chair, the Free State were very conscious of that fact, and so didn't want to shoot yet another member of Parliament in a chair. So he was allowed to linger. He was confined to prison. He was in prison for almost 2 years, elected to the Parliament. And at the end of that period, I've published a couple of books, including his letters, called No Surrender Here, which is sort of his attitude that he would never surrender to the Free State. At the end of his book he had two memoirs, which Tony mentioned. One of them was on the War of Independence, called On Another Man's Wound. And the second one was called The Singing Flame, which covers the whole Civil War period. And he explains himself far better than I can. But he ends with his marvelous line: was, "We who had been beaten in the fight, who had stood the jail war, parted to take up the threads of inscrutable destiny, some to begin life all over again." So, those people who got out of jail in 1924, they'd lost their jobs. They had not had any particular training in the military, because, it wasn't what an organized military was at the time. There were about 12 to 14 people who were let out of jail. And of course, what had happened just before then is the Free State had been decommissioning their own army. So if there were any jobs in rural Ireland or in the cities in Ireland, the jobs would have, first of all, gone to the people perhaps who didn't fight, and secondly, to the non-coms, the people who had just been decommissioned. And there was a great problem in rural Ireland for people who had been anti-Free State, and who were coming back into the local community. And I think it's common knowledge that of those, something like 70 to 80% of the Republicans were forced to flee Ireland. Yet another wave of immigration in that period. Most of them were unmarried, and they came to, first of all, many went to England, and a lot of them came to America. And I'm sure there was a large number that came out to San Francisco. Anyway, in my father's case, what he did, he was in such bad health that he went off to Europe to climb mountains and recover his health. He was told to get some sunshine, and that's what he was doing. He was finally he came back to Ireland, and he went back to his studies in 1926, medical studies. He just wasn't interested. He'd been through too much. He was very disillusioned by the government that had come into place at the time, and he was continued on, but didn't have the heart in what he had wanted to do. But he was always interested in the arts, even when he was on the run. And he founded the UCD Dramatic Society, which sort of seems an odd thing to do, but he was interested in drama. As he was abroad and saw drama in France and Italy and Spain, he was very impressed by the type of modern drama that had occurred, and he wanted to bring that back into Ireland. And so by finding the Dramatic Society, he started to do that. This is quite in contrast to the world famous Abbey Theatre, which in their view at the time was not putting on modern plays. They were putting on Irish plays, which were didn't necessarily have a modern theme. And some of his members who were his friends there, Dennis Devlin, who was a poet, William Fay becomes later ambassador to the United States, Roger McHugh, an academic and literary critic. So these sort of literary characters were in his world. And I think they were indicative of the type of people that he wanted to associate with later. And that particularly is relevant to the people that he met in the United States, or who he wanted to meet with. Now, as he was not doing very well in the studies, it became De Valera and Frank Aiken, both on the Republican side and both members of Fianna Fáil, approached my father, and the idea was to create a press, a newspaper which was independent of the British press, and create that to be a source of news, Irish news for Irish people in the future. But they needed funds to do that. And so father was with Aiken, was sent by De Valera over to New York, and they toured around over for the next 9 months. And basically what I'll cover now is, that tour in the East and on the West, and then what he was doing in California, New Mexico, and he took a little time to go down to Old Mexico. As part of the Irish press campaign, they were again taking advantage of the characters like Aiken and Ernie, and they were sending them to the different cities where there would be a pocket of people who had. We're not talking 1928, so many of those people who got out of jail in 23 and 24 had come over. And there was also a very large Irish American group that had been supportive of home rule as well as independence. But that same group of Irish Americans had faltered over the issue of the treaty. And so there was a split in American political areas between those who supported the treaty and those who wouldn't. De Valera had been condemned by many people. And so here was a De Valera led campaign to raise funds for an Irish press. And, that was problematic in certain sense. But they did a fantastic job in raising, almost $500,000 from different sources around. And here's a headline of my father as he was going to Philadelphia in November 1928. And it said, Irish patriot here, Ernie O'Malley, Irish leader speaks. So he continued around. He went to New York and Boston, Detroit, Chicago twice, Washington, New York, then back to Chicago on his way to the West Coast, Seattle, Portland, Sacramento, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. And that was over a 9-year, 9-month period. He was where he could, he would lecture. He was not a very good lecturer. I mean, I found out evidence that how poor a lecturer he was. He was a competent leader, but didn't have what you call stage presence. So he himself was not a great fundraiser, because you need to have a certain presence in order to press the flesh and persuade people to part with whatever limited money they had. And the types of people he was talking about and with in these communities were mostly immigrants. And, they would not be giving large sums of money. $10 or $20 was still something significant for them, and trying to get $100 was really a major gift. And also the types of community in which he was floated in order to do these were not particularly those interested in the arts or reading or music or literature. So father became disillusioned, I think, by many of the people that he met, and at the same time he was able to meet people whom he did enjoy in the museum world and the art world. One of the keys I came across a couple of years ago in a Seattle newspaper was this, and when he was interviewed in Seattle on that trip, and he said, "My soul lies with the arts. In them lies happiness. I hope to be able to restore Ireland's interest in them. If I could, it would be a far greater reward than becoming the most famous surgeon." So once I read that explanation, it gave me a clue as to where he was headed. And in fact, I went back to look as whether he had been there before. And I found little notebooks that he was carrying around with him in 1917, 1918, when he was on the run with Renaissance art. And he would read his relaxation while in the war was to read Francois Villon. So, I mean, he had a different mentality toward his own interest. Here he comes down from Seattle to Portland, down into San Francisco, and he meets people like Ray Boynton, who was a muralist based, I believe, in Oakland, and his wife. Here's a photograph by Edward Weston of for Ray Boynton. Don't know if your group here knows about Alfred Bender, who was an Irish immigrant in the 1880s to San Francisco and gave the largest gift ever to the Irish National Museum of Art in 1933. And Bender was a significant person in the community because he, in fact, got the visa. He paid for the visa for Diego Rivera to get here. And Rivera came up and would have worked with people like Boynton and other people in the fabulous atmosphere that San Francisco had created long before them for muralists. And there was an incredible muralist experience in San Francisco, a sight to be seen. Anyway, one of the other things Fowler had started in New York was trying to write his memoir. So, what do you do when you want to write a memoir? Well, you want to talk to somebody who's done that. And he knew of, and she knew of him, and this is Ella Young, who was a professor of mythology and Celtic history at University of Berkeley in 1925. She was there for 10 years. And he thought it'd be good to talk to her, figure out what writing is about, how to do it, how do you get published, all those things which young people who have never done it before want to know. She's also was a poet and a mystic. She had written extensively on Irish folklore, which was a great interest of Father's. And then Father would wander down the coast to, he was headed toward Los Angeles, but he dropped off in Carmel and walking on the beach, as one could in those days. I don't know whether you can now. He met Edward Weston and they had a nice chat. And Weston took a photograph of him. Sorry, let me go back here. Yeah, he in his day book he says about O'Malley, had to supper an Irishman, O'Malley by name, whose tales of his part in the rebellion made me realize what a comparatively unexciting life I have led. But excitement can come in different ways, mine through my work. Anyway, so Father had his photograph taken, just because Weston took photographs of people he liked. And so a beautiful photograph of my father sitting in Carmel. And in Carmel, there were people like Robinson Jeffers and his wife Una, and 3 months after meeting my father, guess what? They all go off to Ireland. Philip and Helen McCresson were interested in crafts and arts, and ultimately they're down there and meeting, and they met my father, and they end up in New Mexico. Down in Los Angeles, my father, going through the address book, which Eamon de Valera gave him, met the widow of Peter Golden from Macroom, who had been a great Irish patriot in New York in 1916 and died in 1926. But the widow was going on to Pasadena. And she was very helpful to Father to getting him established in Los Angeles for a little while. And while he was down there, he met John Ford, who became a lifelong friend, and later asks father to help on some of the films that he made in Ireland. Here's a note from Robinson Jeffers to my father. Um, so what happens was, again, my father's life is so fortunate, so lucky. I mean, the people that he happened to meet. Helen Golden had a teenage child, and now what do teenagers want to do? They want to go to the Grand Canyon. So, and of course, I mentioned that father wanted to meet Ella Young, and Helen, who was a friend of Ellen Young, said, "Well, she's in New Mexico." So by the time they had finished peering down the Grand Canyon, they said, "Well, let's go on to New Mexico." So here's the car that my father drove. And you can see the water bags and everything else as they bounced around the very poor roads. They got to New Mexico in September 1929, and on their first day, when they arrived in Taos, they went over to see Mabel Dodge Lujan, who was a New Yorker who came to Taos and established her own sort of art colony there. And in that summer of 1929, she had a couple of guests, distinguished American artists, Ella Young, Miriam Hapgood, Jean Morin, an American artist, Dorothy Brett, who was the amanuensis for D.H. Lawrence in Taos, George O'Keeffe, and Rebecca Strand, who was the wife of Paul Strand. By the time father gets there in September, only Ella Young and Miriam Hapgood are there. But father records that on that first dinner party, and I have in his diary, which he was writing, the minutes of that sort of first meeting that they took. And he says that he and Ella were off in a corner talking about Irish folklore. And of course, that's one of the strengths that she had. And it was one of the things that my father wanted to do. And indeed, I'm still working on my father's folklore, but someone can ask me about that. Anyway, he was very fortunate because when he met Mabel Dodge, Mabel had married a local Taos Puebloan native who had Tony Lujan. And, in the views of an Irishman and a Pueblo native, they would have been fighting in their own cultural wars against two enemies, one of which would have been British and the other would have been the American imperialism, which tried to downplay the role of Native Americans. So Tony and father was very sympathetic to father and introduced him to many other of the Pueblos. And he had a very privileged position in getting to see many of the native dances. And he's made records in an extensive diary, which I've prepared for publication, about his experience in the life and the experience of the Native American. Well, all as perceived by a foreigner walking through their life. Anyway, Mabel Dodge, and here's a photograph of Ella with one of the Golden children, Esna Golden, and they lived in Taos. And here's another famous character, Spud Johnson, or James Johnson, who was a literary character in Taos. And father met other people there, and we know about these because they went to visit him in the World's Fair in 1933 in Chicago, with Ernest Blumenschein and Spud Johnson and Dorothy Brett. In fact, one might ask, well, how was he able to live and survive under these circumstances? Because he didn't have any employment. The money ran out from the Irish press. And but he developed this concept of house sitting. So, when you house sit for, let's say, a Spud Johnson or Dorothy Brett, when they go away to wherever they go, because they had more money than he, and I'm sure they left some house sitting money for him. And the other thing that he greatly appreciated from from them was they had great libraries, and father was a great reader, so he got the advantage of reading the libraries of Spud Johnson and Dorothy Brett, and I think in his way he would say that was reward enough. He then went on with friends to visit these Native American festivals. He was at the time, he had talked to Ella Young, and I guess the best advice for any writer is to keep writing. So what he did is he experienced by writing his diary every day, and then he started writing memories of his military experience. And they became more and more the diaries became more and more sophisticated by including descriptions of people, of landscape that he saw, of and dialogue of people. So they became a very lively diary. And then he incorporated those elements into his in his memoirs, the two memoirs that he wrote, and they also became a very as he said, it's not real history, but it's his history. And he tries to include Irish folklore, Irish heroes, the Tuatha Danann, the Cuchulainn, the mythology which drives and drove him as a youngster, having been raised in the west of Ireland, about Táin Bó Cúailnge and how you really fight to the end for a cause that you want to get done. Anyway, Ella was very helpful in giving him the criticism, and I have the correspondence that she did. Another way that he, don't know how many paintings he actually sold, but I found one of these, and in the right-hand corner down there, in a very weak pencil, is written $90. So he was trying to sell this pencil drawing of the Tawas Mountain for $90 in 1928. He got into poetry, and I love this one. It reminds me of a Connemara setting where he says, "What time is it?" I asked. Juanita shrugged a shoulder as if to say, "Why speak?" He smiled, a quiet, sad look. "There was a yesterday. You see today. For sure there'll be a morrow. He knows only the dawn, the halfway house of noon, infinite evening, sunset, and sleep at night." So father went on to write many more poems in that world. So, I mean, that was the Taoist community. Then he went on to meet, the irony of his lucky life. I mean, he had some bad events in his life, but here he was, a first cousin of his, born in Dublin, daughter of an Englishman, Laithwaite, happened to be the librarian in Santa Fe. And so after he'd spent a couple of months in Tawas, but I think he found that there was too much society down there for him, and he just wanted a quiet place that he could sit and write his memoir. And she invited him to come up to Santa Fe. She later becomes a Dominican nun and a librarian in their headquarters in Detroit. But she has all access to a library, so he can read any books. I think he sleeps on her couch and continues to work on his manuscript. And through her and other people, he meets people in Santa Fe, which is again another whole society. In Santa Fe, Helen McCresson, Peter and Henry, Helen McCresson has come from Carmel to live there. Distinguished character Alice Corbin, who was a poet and was married to Henderson, and she happened to be the co-editor with of the poetry magazine published in Chicago. Another person there was a New York artist, Theodore Goddard, who was a friend of Dorothy Stewart, and they became friends. And in Santa Fe, he was given the opportunity to lecture on Irish history, on literature. He was very proud of the fact that he had a Joyce scholarship group, and Joyce was really cutting edge at that time in 1930. but he had read enough of Joyce, and he was able to get copies of the book and read on it. Again, the society became too much for him and retired to a small little place called Chimayo, which is outside of Santa Fe. But he had met this lady, Dorothy Newkirk Stewart, who is an artist, and he decided that he would do some work with her. She wanted to go back to Mexico. She lived in Mexico for a little while and had done a lot of Mexican um, prints. And so she said, would he, as a gunman with his IRA background, drive herself and Theodore Goddard to Mexico? And so again, I'm sure the arrangement was that, he got a little money for as a driver. He looked like a big male standing up in the front of the car, and I'm sure he proposed to have a gun with him. And in those days, as not unlike today, the banditos in Mexico were, an issue. And so two American ladies wanted to have their bodyguard. So Ernie O'Malley became their bodyguard. Now, Dorothy Stewart's sister, Margaret Stewart Dietrich, was a distinguished lady. And between the two Stewart sisters, they helped do great work in preserving the traditions of Santa Fe, giving to art, creating a community which still exists in a certain way with the historic Santa Fe Foundation on Canyon Road in Santa Fe. Anyway, they took off for for Mexico. And here's one of Dorothy Stewart's prints. And they went down to Mexico for 9 months. And again, luck was with father, not only in meeting with Dorothy, but staying down in Mexico City, researching and doing his diaries. He met up with Catherine Ann Porter, who's an American novelist down there. Hart Crane, he became a good drinking buddy of Hart, who sadly committed suicide soon after on his way home. And he was, again, house sitting for Hart Crane. Just one of those incredible lucky things that he ran into. He ran into Viktor Arnotov, who a very strange Russian man who had fought not only in the Russian Revolution, but in the Chinese wars of the late 20s. Came to San Francisco, knew Boynton and Rivera when he came up. And in fact, Rivera asked him to go down to Mexico. And when father met him, he was painting the frescoes in New Mexico that Diego Rivera was supposed to do. So in an incredible short way, he was meeting up with San Francisco. And because Arnotov could return to San Francisco, did all of his murals work back here. And I went up to the high school the other day on 32nd Avenue and 632nd Avenue and saw this incredible mural that Arnotov had done up there. I encourage anyone to go up and see it. Anyway, also, as he was bumming around Mexico, he runs into Sergei Eisenstein and Edward Tusset. They're making the Thunder Over Mexico movie. And he meets he meets folklorists. He continues, he's trying to get work. He doesn't get work. Continues extensive diaries and photographs, which he has collected throughout his stay down there. So again, here's a little caricature that Dorothy Stewart wrote, and you can see Ernie O'Malley there with his glasses. A very good little caricature of him. Hart Crane writes back to Malcolm Crowley, who was one of the distinguished New York critics at the time, saying, "I've met my most pleasant literary moment with an Irish revolutionary, a red-headed friend of Liam O'Flaherty's, shot and not missed 17 times. The most sincere and appreciative person in many ways whom I've ever met. We drink a lot, look at frescoes, and agree." Anyway, and Hart Crane wrote, here's Hart Crane photograph. This actually photograph, which he gave to my father, is going to be on the cover of a book coming out shortly on Hart Crane. And in his diaries, as he went around, he would do these drawings. And here's Eisenstein and Tissot. Anyway, what he decided that after 6-7 months down there, he couldn't find work, and Dorothy Stewart had done enough of her artwork, and they believe, and they returned to Santa Fe. And again, father continued with his writing experience. He lived again in Chimayo. It was interesting in all of his writings, there was no reference to the US Depression that had been set up. And I had to ask myself, how come? And the answer is, some people live so far below the level of an income level that whether there's a depression going on or not, if you don't have a source of income, you're just well below that level of concern. But what happened in his life was New Mexican schools were closed down, and the Golden family that I'd mentioned earlier, Helen Golden asked Ernie to tutor her 3 children. So he went to Taos again in December 1931 and early 32 to tutor those children. He ran the household in a strict disciplinarian. Helen was in hospital with pneumonia, so it was all up to him. And again, he was fortunate because Paul Strand had turned up in New Mexico at the time, and they had a great, strong, lifelong friendship. We used to stay with the Strands in Paris in the 50s. So Paul got to know him, really liked him, and was very, very helpful. And in fact, Paul Strand was key for, here's a photograph that he took of my father. And he writes in one of his memoirs, which I found in a Taos bookstore, O'Malley has just left. That is, he had said goodbye, and I haven't met a finer person. Yesterday and today, he read from his book, which begins with his boyhood, his life within the imperialist family, education, and finally the inner and outward development, which brought him into the Irish Revolution, in which he was finally second in command. Book should be published. Father had a great problem trying to get his book published. He, for the next 3 years, 32 to 35, he wrote, and he got rejection letters from 12 different publishing groups. So he had to go back to Ireland to publish it. And that was one of the driving reasons why he left America. But meantime, Dorothy Stewart wanted her car to be in the East Coast in Philadelphia, so she loaned it to father. He drove back to New York, and with Paul Strand's introductions, he got into the Yaddo Foundation to continue writing his book. He met with people like Harold Clurman in the theater group in New York. But, though they very much liked him, here's the Yaddo Foundation, and he was in the class of September 32. With a lot of significant American intellectuals who were passing through the Yaddo Foundation at the time, and were very helpful to him. Ted Stevenson, Sidney Hook, Mary Vorse, Aaron Copland was up there, Israel Sitkowitz. Later he meets George O'Keeffe in New York. I mean, one of the ironies of my father's life was my mother was an artist, whom I'll talk a little bit about. And he, the immigrant, was introducing my American mother to George O'Keeffe, which, you would think it would be the other way around. But anyway, and he met another young American, James Johnson Sweeney. And I remember meeting James in the west of Ireland because he bought a house near us. And I thought, wow, Americans must be crazy. And he was talking about a museum that would go around and round like that. And I said, oh my gosh, these Yankees are really incredible. Well, he was then the director of the Guggenheim Museum. And anyone who's seen it in New York, it goes around and round and round. It was supposedly built as the original design was built as a mountaintop restaurant in Arizona, and that whole thing got conveyed into New York to look like the Guggenheim. Anyway, the father continued in New York, would manage to keep his writing going. Failed to, he finished his works, but it was, a pretty high period of depression in New York at the time. But just then he happened to meet my mother. Woo! Yeah. Anyway, uh, um, let me just show you that again. And I guess that's someone you want to take a second look at. Um, and he met her, and he said he was going to be spending that summer out in Chicago at the World's Fair, and she went out to see him. And next year, I mean, later that year, he came back to New York, and they sort of got together, and I guess fell in love. But he applied for an Irish pension, and which he was able to get. But he continued to, try to publish his poetry. He did publish his poetry in Poetry Magazine in Chicago, but he got rejections for all of his other efforts. And most recently, I'm now working on my father's fiction. Several of Irish authors from that time, Frank O'Connor, Sean Fillon, Liam O'Flaherty, were starting to publish their short stories. So I've just discovered my father's sort of short stories and vignettes, and will be working to publish them. Anyway, in 35, they decide to go back to Ireland. Here's a photograph of him. And here's, she was a sculptor, a photographer, a painter, well-traveled internationalist. And here's one of the sculptures that she did as a young lady. They go back to Ireland, they marry. He gets his pension. Paul Strand comes to visit him in Ireland, a little known factor. And in fact, Paul later asks father to do a book with him about Ireland, and that Paul was going to do his photographs. But again, one of the many missed opportunities in Ireland was that that failed to come through. Anyway, well, look, I think I've there's a lot of other stories that going on in Ireland. He publishes his book finally called On Another Man's Wound. He's very disillusioned with Ireland. He starts taking photographs, goes down the West Country, lives in a nice house in Ireland, gets into folklore and art history. Here's a family photograph in 19. Oop, that's a bad one. And he has creative interests on Irish art criticism, becomes books editor of various magazines. He starts writing history, does the Sunday Press IRA raids. Here's one of Paul Strand's wife's photograph of him in 1956. He makes 2 movies with John Ford, and he dies in very poor health in 1957. And he's given a state funeral with, here's Sean Lamass, future Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera, future then president, then Taoiseach and future president, and Frank Aiken. And if you look carefully, you'll see me in that photograph. Here's the new book that I've just written with Harry Martin, Ernie O'Malley, A Life, available on Amazon, and a bunch of other books, but I've run out of time, I think. So there we are, Tony.
Well, fabulous. Thank you very much. Now I'm intrigued and I want to know more. And now that the hour went like that, and so I do want to open this up for questions. Perhaps I'll lead with a sort of a broad general one while people think of other questions, and that is how you think of your father. I mean, he seems to have been almost an accidental rebel and soldier, and he served with great distinction and honor. But that does not seem to, he was not at all, he was an intellectual, not at all a sort of a military man. So how do you think of your father?
Well, I think he's, I love those words that he said at the beginning that I quoted, that whoever you are, you can be called to act by way of responsibility. So he was a student, but he saw a movement and he said, this is where I need to be right now. I need to help. And the penny hadn't dropped on him totally on Irish nationalism. He'd heard about all of this. He'd seen his father sort of make fun of the Irish volunteers. He'd seen his brothers go off to join the British Army. And when the occasion came, he decided to take action. His action happened to be military. It was certainly not in his nature. He'd never gone to any of these schools that people go to where you get a military attitude. And he didn't have a military attitude. He had a patriotic attitude, which was, this is the time that I need to serve for my country as long as I need to do and as long as I'm standing up. And so he sort of took an 8-year, what he called an 8-year crusade between 1916 and 1924, took those years out of his life and did what he needed to do and suffered greatly for it. So, I mean, when I found that reference to being interested in the arts in 1928, it was suddenly a clue to, who he was and where he wanted to be. And so, I mean, I think he had that attitude, but never as expressed as in that article or that interview. So he was never meant to be a military person, but he just happened to be. And once he got involved, he took it seriously.
Thank you. And you were barely a teenager when he passed away. So all of this activity you're engaged now, you get to know your father, don't you?
Right. Yeah. No, definitely. And I got to know my mother later because she was alive. But both of them, the real treasures are in digging through what I call the legacy, the documents that they left, the photographs that they left. Their joint photography of Ireland in the 1930s is really significant, and hope we get to have a glimpse of it out here in San Francisco. But we recently had a major exhibit of her photographs in the National Library of Ireland, along with the Photo Museum of Ireland.
I'd like to know more about that. Becky has a question.
Yeah, more an observation, really. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I think the disparity between his interest in the arts and his ability to function effectively as a military person suggests he was an enormously intelligent man who was able to put the chaotic situation of the rebellion to good use and to be very, very functional and effective within that, and then to turn that intelligence to keeping himself afloat in the American scene with the interest in folklore and the interest in the arts in Santa Fe and Taos, both of which places you can survive on house sitting and tutoring very well if you're smart. And he just sounds like a wonderfully smart man. Also, you have this tremendous legacy of photographs, which we just glimpsed in this presentation. And I, for one, would love to see a photographic exhibit, both of the family photographs and of the more impersonal Irish photographs that your parents put together. Thank you for this talk.
You can go to o'malleycollection.com and you'll see a series of photographs that I've put up there. It's a tip of the iceberg, but more will come.
Stay tuned, everybody, for an exhibit that I'm going to be helping out with on Helen Hooker's photographs. Hopefully next fall, we'll be getting to see this great work. Can you see that there?
East Western Ways, is it?
Western Ways. It's one of two books. But anyway, that's not my question. But let's keep on top of this great body of photos. We have to work together to try and get this to San Francisco next year. Folklore stuff, Cormac. What is it you've found? What are you working on as far as this folklore goes?
So I found a whole series of notebooks that he had worked on in the winter of 1940 when they left Dublin, went down to Mayo, and they started farming, and then the emergency occurred, and Irish people like himself would sort of say, okay, with vim and vigor, we will create our own farm, have employment. But farmers during the winter don't have the same things to do. So he went out and revived his interest in folklore. And so he got interviews from 20 different storytellers. And I am working on the transcription and translation, in effect, of about 330 stories that he hand wrote from these people. So I'm trying to, interpret those, get the names right and the locations, and they cover. I mean, some of them go back to 1798, and some are about stories of seeing ghosts just 15 months before he wrote these stories down. They relate to island lore, folklore, Clare Island. Landlords, Into the Valley of Death wrote the 600. Well, a lot of people think that's about the Crimea, but it really just an Irish landlord story between two landlords, one of whom wanted to kill the other. And what better than sending him down into the Valley of Death, hoping he'd die. And, ironically enough, he didn't die, he survived. And so anyway, but these folklore are very much alive, and with great stories about, common banal activities. But when you look at it and saying this is 100 years old, it's no longer so banal. Mm-hmm. What has astounded me is the attitude of the Irish landlord. And no doubt some of them could have been Catholic. I haven't figured out all of those details, but they had literally life and death control over their tenants, either to kick them off the land, or if they're didn't pay the rent on time or whatever. Getting kicked off your land meant, in effect, death or immigration. Mm-hmm. So these folklores, it's going to be exciting, and maybe we'll do a reading out here.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking forward to that, Cormac.
Sorry, Joe, you have a question?
I do have a question. This is the question that at one point, perhaps, Cormac, you asked us to ask you. I'm interested in Ella Young, so I'm very interested in the connection that your father had with her. And so if you could elaborate on that, or actually, I'm just asking the question that you asked somebody that you said you hope somebody would ask. Perhaps you would do.
Well, nice to meet you, Joe. And my email is cormac.o'malley@gmail.com if anyone wants to follow up with me on any issues. But if you're familiar with Ella Young, you'll be familiar with her biography of 1943, in which she refers to Ernie O'Malley. I did go to the internet this morning just to check some details about Ella, and it said on that biography you need to read it very circumspectly, because she wasn't too accurate on a lot of stuff. But anyway, that was her own sort of real memoir, and it was written some years later. But what she was, she was a moving spirit in California. Truly radical spirit in I don't know if you've done a program before on her on this. You have, okay. But so when I have the interview, or not interview, the diary reaction that they have talking about, and I couldn't believe it when I transcribed it. The first thing that Father promised Ella Young to do was that when he went back to Ireland, she was going to send him money to help get a tape recorder or whatever they had in those days to do recording of folklore. He didn't say where, but guess what? That was what, 1929, and 1940. Here, Father starts doing the folklore, and let's see, what year are we now? 2022. his son, inspired by his Ella Young, is trying to transcribe
Ah,
the stuff that she had gotten him to do. So the material was preserved, fortunately, and can now be written about.
ah, ah, great.
And I have several letters from Ella to my father, criticizing his poetry, being very helpful. And so, in fact, he found what would you call a mentor, to help him. And even though he stayed down in Taos and she went back to, was it Halicon Valley in
Oceana, yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
How do you say that?
Well, I'm not really sure. I haven't ever heard anyone say it.
Okay, caught you out.
But it's by Pismo Beach, right? It's right down that little stretch of Central California.
It's near Ojai. It's towards
Yes.
the
Oh, it's that far
Ojai.
south. I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Wherever that Indian, there's an Indian, and I'm sure she might have been, there were theosophists in the place where she was when she was interested in that, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Oh, thank you for this has been a wonderful, thank you very much for this.
Any other questions? I'll ask one. Given what an interesting life he pursued, and the fact that he did really pursue a life in the arts and was a peer with all these intellectuals that we know from our history in Northern California, what do you think he would have been had he been born in a different era in a different place?
Well, I do think he would probably have been a literary person. Now, he started his literary efforts by writing about himself. I think maybe many artists do that. You don't have to go through a war in order to write about yourself. But I think the driving force in his circumstance was to write about himself during the war. But as I said, many literary efforts just start out by writing. And so you have his diaries, you have, it was always going to be something artistic. I mean, his photography, I mean, even that relatively crude little image of Mount Tawas, Mount Lobo. I was up there not too long ago, and I took a photograph and compared it to his little drawing. Very good semblance of Mount Lobo. So he could have, because of his extensive reading, and I guess when he was at the university creating that literary dramsoc, as it's now referred to in Dublin, and he was starting to meet with the more intellectual elements. I mean, intellectual. They were just regular people, who happened to be interested in not only in the regular football, but also carrying on, drinking wine, citing poetry, and reading on the intellectual side of things. And it so happens they become ambassadors and things like that. But I mean, who has a sign on their neck saying I'm a thinker? We all need to find these people out and enjoy them when we can.
Right.
So I just think Father would have been in the creative world.
Yeah. Not a surgeon.
Yeah.
His brother was a doctor, I see. But
He had 3 doctors in the
Wow.
family.
okay, so that's enough, and he can be the literary figure.
Yeah. There were no nuns in this generation, but there were like in the prior generation. It would be just interesting to give, because I checked it the other day, that in my grandfather's family would be Luke Malley. And the family name is Malley, not O'Malley, by the way. Luke Malley had 6 children. And Luke Malley had 11 children, 2 women. They became nurses. And in the prior family, his father was a Luke, had 6 children, And of those 6 children, 4 went to the United States, and 3 became nuns.
Mhm.
So, and in my grandmother's family of 14, there were about 4 nuns. So, late 19th century, people were, it was very, it wasn't, what's the famous saying? Thank God we have a priest in the family. I mean, that was number 1. And then try to get a nun in the family, and then try to get a doctor in the family. So, you'd be saved and healed.
That's just great. Do we have any other questions? If not, I'll close this session and with a round of applause, silent applause. And thank you profusely for your fascinating presentation. It leaves us wanting more, to know more and to hear from you more, and to buy your book, which is on Amazon. Once again, can you hold that up or tell us the title once again, please? It'll be a little blurry.
It's called Ernie O'Malley, A Life, by Harry Martin and Cormac O'Malley.
There you have it. Okay, well, thank you very, very much. And we're really thrilled. Perhaps next time we'll see you in person. Maybe we can make that happen. But thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you very much, Cormac O'Malley.
Thank you indeed.
Great.
Okay.
Terrific talk. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.